Hi, my name is Norm Miller, and this is an introduction to Valuation Class 1, Part 1. By way of introduction, valuation happens to be an important subject. It supports capital formation in debt markets. If somebody's making a loan, they need to know what the collateral is worth behind the loan. So, good valuation supports good debt markets and capital markets and allows buyers and sellers to have a better idea what properties are worth. So appraisal matters, valuation matters, being able to estimate market value matters for market efficiency. Now how you do that, of course, is with information. And you need to know something about the property rights owned, the occupants, the leases, the operations of the property, the limitations on the property. But we often don't have perfect information, so the best appraisers are really good at using the best information that you have and generating techniques and methods to come up with value with that information. Now, of course, there's uncertainty, and appraisal is an art, not a science, which is why appraisers will disagree on value. How good appraisers are might surprise you. If you take a neighborhood with a fair amount of heterogeneity, that is unique homes, where they're not all the same, and you don't tell them the asking price on a property and you said, please estimate selling price, how many of them do you think are going to be within 10% of the selling price? And the answer might surprise you, but it's only 65%. Now if it's a homogeneous neighborhood where all the homes are similar, it's probably going to be around 85%. But in an area where it's hard to compare properties, you're going to see numbers closer to 65%. And again, it's an art, not a science. And getting more than 65% within 10% of a selling price is doing pretty good in unique markets or markets where the properties are not cookie-cutter properties. One of the factors that might depend on whether an appraiser is high or low is who picks the appraiser. And another factor is which way market trends are going. So if prices are moving fast upward, the appraisers tend to lag because they rely on history. They do not forecast. And if they've been going up and they're using comps that had sold previously or comparable properties that are similar to the subject property, they may end up with an estimate of value below the current market value of a property. The reverse is also true. That is, if prices are going down, they may lag on the upside. But if they're going up fast, it would create problems when financing a property in an upward market. And that could be an issue if they're relying on history and not estimating how prices are changing. We also have what we call a clientele effect. That is, people that pick appraisers may pick those that are by nature optimistic or pessimistic. If I'm doing a property tax appeal, I may want a pessimistic appraiser. And if I'm doing if I'm going in for financing, I may want an optimistic appraiser. So who selects the appraiser matters. Now, one of the problems that we have in the real estate industry is the fact that residential mortgage lenders have tended to pick appraisers that simply justify the deal. And historically, 95% or more of the appraisals ended up right at the contract price or higher. And so they really weren't stopping bad loans from being made by telling a borrower when they were overpaying. And of course, the problem with being a objective appraiser and maybe coming up with a value below what the borrower was paying more often than, say, 5%, say 50% of the time, is you wouldn't get hired very often. And so we have to be sympathetic to appraisers. If you want it to work, you need to justify the deal, or you're not going to be asked to appraise property again. There are solutions to this, and there are ways of getting around this that Congress has considered, but we still make we still need to make more progress on who picks the appraiser and not penalizing appraisers for being conservative. I want to talk a little bit about the roots of real estate, which are also the roots of valuation. And this is a little bit of paying heed to our predecessors. The point of this is that things change, methods change, and if you would ask an appraiser, how you do something, they may think that what they're doing now has been around a long time, but in fact the field's been constantly evolving. The methods have been changing, and they'll continue to change. But let me introduce to you the father or the great-grandfather of real estate. His name was Richard Ely. And he started writing about real estate as an academic field in the late 1800s. In fact, he started the first real estate program. Others followed in his place and studied with him, men like Richard Hurd, Ernest Fisher, Fred Babcock. And they knew that as the United States was going through the end of the industrialization era and developing better capital markets, they knew that valuation was an important subject, an important education. We can actually look at a timeline, and it goes something like this, where different contributors wrote books on how to do real estate appraisal. And I'm not going to go into great detail on this, but you could look up some of these names if you're interested. But one of the points is not only were the methods changing, but they were changing in part because of technology. Before 1960, we didn't have electronic calculators very often. At least very few had electronic calculators, and they would have cost a fortune back then. So we would use tables and other methods, but the personal computers, which grew around 1982, revolutionized appraisal and what we could do. And today, of course, we can combine nearly real-time information with real-time calculations, and that has changed the field a great deal. And last, I'd like to point out that even the theories and methods, again, have changed. The definitions of value have evolved. We tend to use most probable price as our estimate of market value. It's a statistical approach. We can also use discounted cash flow as a valuation technique, a method we're going to go into in more detail later on. And we've greatly refined how we capitalize future returns into value. And today we're even using AVMs, or automated valuation models. And that is also changing the field. Here's Richard Ely. 1854 is when he was born. 1943, again, he was really the father of real estate in the field, and he established the first program at the University of Wisconsin and the first department of real estate and land economics, 1925. And he wrote a book, Outlines of Land Economics, 1893. Richard Hurd, he wrote Principles of City Land Values. He introduced two types of value: intrinsic value, that's kind of utilitarian value, exchange value, what is it worth in the market. And he introduced the modern interpretation of highest and best use. He called it highest utilization, but it's really what is the most productive use you would put on a site if it was vacant or not vacant. An important concept that we will expand upon. Other authors like Babcock continued to refine the definitions. He distinguished value from price and continued to describe three basic approaches to value, even though there might be several cost approaches or several income approaches. His three basic approaches we still use today: income, market, and cost. Each method out there really depends on what information you have. And again, I'm going to expand on that, but one of the points that Babcock made is that the cost approach is irrelevant in finding true market value. It tends to be more of a constraint on value, and that's a point to keep in mind today. He also criticized the idea of taking your separate indications of value and just putting them all together as if they're all equally valid. And what he said is you should rely more on the methods that have the best information. Another big contributor to the field, Herman Hoyt, passed away in 1984. He worked for the FHA, helped to establish that. He wrote one of the first books called 100 Years of Land Values in Chicago. Rumor is that the reason why it was 100 years is because he liked the girl behind the counter where he got the property tax records and deeds, and he just kept going back and adding more years. That may or may not be true, but his long-term trend analysis did help establish the field of real estate and how we analyze market trends today. Richard Ratcliff, another father of appraisal, also worked at the University of Wisconsin. And he criticized the ability to split land and building components, and he promoted discounted cash flow type analysis that we use in investment analysis as an appraisal technique if the typical buyer is a typical investor. He also introduced different types of values: market value, subjective value, cost of reproduction. And he introduced the concept of most probable price, a statistical approach, as the best way of getting market value. There's another man named Pete Ellwood who was way ahead of his time, and he came up with tables that would allow us to discount future returns from real estate back to present value before we had computers. And we no longer use Ellwood tables, but we can copy his methods, and it's one of the methods that I teach. And also we have Paul Wendt, passed away in 2000, who helped to found programs at Berkeley and Georgia and wrote many books on real estate appraisal. Here's Paul down at the Herman Hoyt Institute meetings where he was probably flirting with somebody, but certainly a thought leader for many years. And one of my favorites that I personally knew, Jim Graskamp at the University of Wisconsin. He started the first graduate program in real estate. In 1970, he started a PhD program. He criticized the idea of highest and best use as arrogant, and he preferred to use the term most probable use. Other contributors to the field, Charles Ackerson made it easier to understand Ellwood, and I'll use his techniques. Jeff Fisher, a colleague of mine, who took Ellwood techniques and showed how to do them before and after tax. And there's Jeff in his younger days. Pete Colwell in 2002, he integrated all the different methods of appraisal, and that showed that really it was a subpart of finance, consistent with finance, and consistent with economics. So what have we learned from all this? Well, the biggest contributions in real estate came from people named Richard, just by chance. And it turns out that all of these thought leaders were very critical of the industry they helped to create, and that most of the evolutions in theory and methods don't occur in a vacuum. Each of these major contributors studied under a leader in the field They studied with somebody else, and they built upon that foundation. And last, we could note that all these thought leaders tended to live a long time, especially for early 1900s, mid-1900s compared to now. And that's kind of interesting. So maybe if you're a thought leader, you'll live a long time too. What else? What else have we learned? The field's always changing. Don't let yourself be put into a methodological straitjacket. Don't be too preconditioned not to use a little common sense. Another colleague, Dan Colehep, would say, does it pass the sniff test? Doesn't make sense. You should always keep that in mind. And sometimes we have new problems, and you need new methods. That's how the field progresses. So don't ever accept industry practices as state of the art. Maybe you can contribute to improving the state of the art. This is the end of part 1. I thank you for your attention, and I'm going to talk about designations and appraisal uses and definitions in the next part.